Deep inland, hundreds of miles from any coast, an archaeologist brushes the dirt from a small object and freezes. It is a seashell, a tiny sea snail shell with a hole bored neatly through it, so it could be strung on a cord. And it has no business being here. The nearest ocean is a 5-day walk away, across mountains and rivers. This shell did not crawl here. It did not wash up here. Somebody carried it, hand over hand, valley after valley, all the way from a beach they would never see, to this spot in the middle of a continent, 30,000 years ago. And that shell is not alone. Across the ancient world, the same impossible thing keeps turning up. Volcanic glass, hundreds of miles from any volcano. Amber from a single cold sea, buried in graves 1,000 miles to the south. Precious stones that spent generations traveling further than the people who carried them ever could. Which means that long, long before money, before writing, before cities, before the wheel, before farming, small bands of hunter-gatherers had somehow built something astonishing, a web of exchange stretching across whole continents, goods flowing from hand to hand to hand, across mountains and deserts and seas. So here is the question. How did people with no coins, no markets, no shops, no writing, and no bosses run a trade network that spanned the world? Did ancient humans have a global economy? Let's find out. Start with the most stubborn clue of all. Volcanic glass. Its proper name is obsidian, and to a Stone Age human, it was the finest material on Earth. When a volcano erupts and its lava cools fast enough, it freezes into a black glass. And when you strike that glass just right, it shatters into blades sharper than surgical steel. An obsidian edge can be honed just a few molecules thick. Nothing in the ancient toolkit cut cleaner. For skinning an animal, carving meat, or shaving a hide, obsidian was the best knife in the world. But here's the thing about obsidian. It only forms at volcanoes. And every volcano's glass carries a chemical fingerprint, a unique signature of trace elements baked in when it erupted. So when scientists find an obsidian blade, they can test it and say, with startling precision, exactly which mountain it came from. And what they found rewrote the story. At a huge ancient town called Çatalhöyük, in what is now Turkey, people were using obsidian from volcanoes over 100 miles away. On the Greek islands, archaeologists found obsidian from an island called Melos, sitting at sites on the mainland from 11,000 years ago. To get there, that glass had to cross open sea, which means people were building boats and paddling out of sight of land to trade before they had even invented farming. Blades were traveling hundreds of miles from the mountains that made them. And obsidian was only the beginning. Go back to that seashell. Not just one, but thousands of them. Tiny sea snails, a species called Nasarius, with holes deliberately punched through so they could be worn. Some are over 100,000 years old, from caves in Africa and the Middle East. And they turn up far, far inland, worn smooth by handling, sometimes stained with red ochre. They are among the oldest jewelry on Earth. And jewelry, it turns out, is one of the very first things humans ever traded. Then there is amber, fossilized tree resin, warm and golden, that washes up on the shores of one cold northern sea, the Baltic. And yet Baltic amber has been dug out of graves and settlements thousands of miles to the south, all across ancient Europe. A drop of sunlight from a freezing northern beach, carried hand to hand down the length of a continent, because people simply wanted it. Even ordinary stone traveled. The best flint, the kind that flakes into perfect tools, does not appear just anywhere. So ancient people dug for it. At places like Grimes Graves in England and Spiennes in Belgium, they sank hundreds of deep shafts into the earth with nothing but antler picks, chasing seams of flint far underground. They hauled it up, shaped it into rough blanks, and sent those blanks out across the land. These were the first mines and the first quarries, feeding the first supply chains. and some objects traveled so far they seemed to defy belief. High in the Italian Alps, on the slopes of a mountain called Monte Viso, Neolithic people quarried a beautiful green stone called Jadeite and ground it over hundreds of hours into gleaming polished axes. Many of these axes were far too delicate and precious to ever chop wood. They were treasures. And archaeologists have found them scattered across the whole of Europe, from Italy to Scotland to Denmark, 1,000 miles and more from that single Alpine peak. A green axe quarried on one mountaintop ended up buried as a sacred object at the far edge of the continent. Then there are the spondylus shells, spiny oysters from the warm Aegean Sea, carved into bracelets and beads. They traveled deep into the heart of Europe, worn by farmers who lived so far from the coast they may never have heard the sound of waves. And in that famous grave at Sungir in Russia, 2 children were buried under thousands of beads carved from mammoth ivory, a hoard of wealth that took uncountable hours of labor, an entire fortune poured into the ground. So the map of the ancient world was not a scatter of isolated tribes. It was a living net. Obsidian flowing out from the volcanoes, shells flowing in from the coasts, amber drifting south, jadeite axes and flint spreading out from the mountains and the mines. Every band a knot in a web that reached further than any single person ever walked. And before we ask how, sit for a moment with how strange this is. Because trading with strangers is one of the rarest things in all of nature. Chimpanzees, our closest cousins, share food inside their own group grudgingly. But a chimp will never carry a fruit across the forest to swap it with a chimp from a rival troop. To a chimpanzee, the strange group across the valley is not a trading partner. It is a threat to be attacked. Almost no animal on Earth exchanges goods with strangers. We alone do it constantly, with people we have never met and will never see again. The instinct to look at a stranger and think, not enemy, but customer, may be one of the strangest and most powerful things about our species. Which brings us back to the real mystery. Not what they traded, but how. Because they were doing all of this with no money at all. Picture the problem. You have a beautiful obsidian blade. I have a basket of dried fish. How many fish is your blade worth? There is no price tag, no coins, no number we both agree on. And if you cheat me today, there is no court, no police, no contract to protect me. So how does anyone trade at all? The first answer is the simplest one. Barter. A straight swap, this for that. My fish for your blade, haggled out on the spot until we both walk away content. And barter certainly happened. But barter has a crippling flaw, and economists have a name for it. The double coincidence of wants. Think about it. For a swap to work, I must have exactly what you want, and you must have exactly what I want at the very same moment. If you need fish, but I only have furs, we are stuck. If I want your blade, but you have no use for anything I own, no deal. Pure barter is clumsy and slow. It could never, on its own, move a seashell across a continent. So something else had to be going on. Something cleverer. And that something was the gift. This is the part that feels strangest to us, with our receipts and our prices. For most of human history, the most powerful form of trade was not selling. It was giving. You give a valuable gift to someone in a neighboring band. You expect nothing back today. But you have just done something powerful. You have placed them under an obligation, a debt of honor. And one day, when the time is right, they will give you something in return, usually something even better, to discharge the debt and put the obligation back on you. We can still see this system alive today. Off the coast of Papua New Guinea, islanders practice something called the Kula Ring. Men climb into canoes and paddle across dangerous open water, sometimes for days, to give each other shell ornaments. Red shell necklaces travel around a great ring of islands in one direction. White shell armbands travel the other way. the objects themselves are almost useless. You cannot eat them. Their entire value is in the giving. And through that endless circle of gifts, dozens of scattered island communities are bound into a single web of alliance, obligation, and peace. That is the secret. For ancient people, an exchange was never just about the object. A trade was a relationship. Every gift was a treaty. Every shell that changed hands was a promise. I share with you now so that when my hunt fails and my children are hungry, I have a friend across the valley who remembers and who shares with me. Trade was not just how ancient humans got luxuries. It was how they survived the bad years. And this quietly solves our puzzle of the traveling shell, because almost nobody actually carried that shell across the whole continent. They did not need to. Each person only ever traded with their neighbors, the bands a day or two away. You pass the shell to the group over the hill. They pass it to the group beyond them. They pass it on again. The object ripples outward, band to band to band, each handing it just a little further along than the last. Archaeologists call it down-the-line trade. No single traveler, no caravan, no map. Just a chain of countless small, friendly handoffs, and at the end of it, a seashell sitting 1,000 miles from the sea, having crossed a continent that not one of the people who carried it ever did. And gift-giving could run to breathtaking extremes. Among the peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast of America, chiefs held vast ceremonies called the Potlatch. A chief would invite his rivals to a feast and then give away almost everything he owned. Blankets, canoes, food, carved copper shields, piled up and handed out, or sometimes simply destroyed, thrown on the fire in front of everyone. It sounds insane. Why burn your own wealth? Because in that world, status did not come from what you hoarded. It came from what you could afford to give away. The man who gave the most won. Generosity itself was the flex, and the gift was a weapon. So an exchange could be a bribe, a boast, a challenge, a peace treaty, or a marriage. When two bands wanted to seal an alliance, they exchanged gifts, and often people, sons and daughters marrying across the group, each wedding a kind of trade that knotted two families together for a generation. Goods, favors, information, and people all flowed along the very same routes. The trail that carried an obsidian blade also carried news of a distant drought, word of a coming herd, a marriage proposal, a warning of war. Sometimes they did not even need to meet. In many parts of the world, travelers describe a practice called silent trade. One group leaves a pile of goods at a known spot on the border, then withdraws out of sight. The other group comes, inspects the goods, and lays down what they think is a fair exchange beside it, then also withdraws. The first group returns. If they are happy, they take the payment and leave. If not, they wait, and the offer is sweetened. Two peoples who may not even share a language, who may fear each other, can still trade, patiently, without a single word or a drop of blood. And there were places where all of this came together. Once or twice a year, when the salmon ran thick, or the reindeer herds passed through, or the nuts ripened, scattered bands would converge on the same rich spot and camp side by side, sometimes hundreds of people who spent the rest of the year apart. These great gatherings were the ancestors of every market, fair and festival that has ever existed. People came to feast and to dance, to find husbands and wives, to settle quarrels, and above all, to trade. You brought the obsidian from your mountains. They brought shells from their coast. Someone else brought furs, or amber, or a new song, or a bit of gossip about the world beyond the horizon. For a few short weeks, the whole web of exchange gathered in one place, humming, and then it scattered again, carrying its goods and its stories back out to the edges of the known world. But as these networks grew, a new problem appeared. Gifts and favors work when everyone knows everyone. But how do you trade with a stranger, whose reputation you do not know, whose promise means nothing to you. You need something else. You need a thing that is valuable to everyone, that does not rot, that is easy to carry and hard to fake. You need money, or at least its ancestor. And so, all over the world, certain objects began to take on a special role. Not because a king declared it, but because everyone quietly agreed they held their value. Those strings of shell beads stop being mere decoration and start becoming a way to store wealth and settle debts. In many societies, cattle became walking bank accounts. Elsewhere, it was salt, precious, and universally needed. Or standardized stone axes, or bolts of cloth, or blocks of cacao. This is what economists call commodity money, a useful thing that everyone will accept, because everyone knows everyone else will accept it too. One little seashell did this so well it became money across half the planet. The cowrie. Small, tough, pretty, impossible to counterfeit, and easy to count. For thousands of years, from Africa to China, cowrie shells were spent like coins. A shell that began as a necklace ended up as cash. Then came the accountants, and they changed everything. In the ancient Middle East, as villages swelled into the first cities, people needed to keep track of who owed what. Somebody stored grain in a communal store and needed a record of it. So they began using small clay tokens, a little cone for a measure of grain, a little sphere for a jar of oil. To seal a deal, they would press the tokens into a lump of wet clay, or later, scratch a mark to stand for each one. At first, they sealed the tokens inside hollow clay balls, a sealed envelope of debt, so no one could cheat by adding or removing a token. But if the count was locked away inside the ball, how could you check it without breaking it open? So someone had the clever idea of pressing each token into the soft outside of the ball before sealing it, leaving its shape stamped on the surface. And then came the leap. If the mark on the outside already tells you what is inside, why bother with the tokens at all? Why not just make the marks? A cone pressed in clay means grain. A sphere means oil. Add a few strokes to show how many. And that, quietly, was one of the most important moments in all of history. Because those little accounting marks, those scratches standing for goods and debts, slowly grew into the world's first writing. The earliest clay tablets we can read from the city of Uruk are not epics or prayers. They are lists. So many measures of barley. So many jars of beer. Who owed what to whom? Read that again. We did not invent writing to compose poetry, or record our gods, or tell our stories. The earliest writing we can read is receipts. Humanity learned to write, it seems, mostly so it could do the books. Trade did not just move objects across the world. Trade gave us the written word itself. From there, it was a short walk to money as we would know it. In the great cities of Mesopotamia, people began to reckon value in metal, above all in silver. But there were no coins yet. Instead, they used silver by weight, in lumps, rings, and coils, weighed out on a balance against small stone weights for every serious deal. They even fixed a standard unit for it, the shekel, which began its life not as a coin, but simply as a weight of grain, and then of silver. A worker's wages, the price of an ox, the fine for an injury, all could now be written down and settled in so many shekels of silver. For the first time, wildly different things, a day of labor, a jar of oil, a stolen sheep, could be measured against a single silver yardstick. And finally, around 2,500 years ago, in a kingdom called Lydia, someone had a beautifully simple idea. Take a small lump of precious metal, stamp it with an official mark to guarantee its weight and purity, and let that stamp do the trusting for you. No more weighing, no more testing. Just hand over the coin. The first coins were born, and the world has never stopped counting since. And here is the deepest thing of all. Those trade routes did not only carry objects, they carried ideas. When an obsidian blade traveled down the the knowledge of how to work it often traveled with it. Along the very same paths that moved shells and amber, humanity passed its greatest inventions from group to group. How to plant a seed and farm. How to fire a clay pot. How to smelt copper, then bronze, then iron. New words, new gods, new songs, even new genes, as strangers met, traded, and married. A good idea, born once in a single valley, could now ripple across the whole web until it belonged to everyone. Trade turned scattered, isolated bands into something entirely new. A connected species, sharing a single growing pool of knowledge. It is not too much to say that trade is what wove 7 billion separate lives into one civilization. So step back and look at the whole staggering journey. It begins with a hand picking up a black shard of volcanic glass, or a pretty shell on a beach. It runs through gifts and debts and silent piles of goods left at the forest edge. It passes through cattle and salt and cowrie shells, through clay tokens that became writing, through weighed silver and the first stamped coins. And it has never stopped. Every time you tap a card at a checkout or order something from the other side of the planet and watch it arrive at your door, you are the newest link in the oldest chain there is. The container ship crossing the ocean is a descendant of a dugout canoe paddling toward the island of Melos. The global supply chain that clothes and feeds you is the great-great-grandchild of a shell passed from hand to hand to hand. So did ancient humans have a global economy? They had no money, no banks, no writing, and no maps. And yet they built a world where a blade could travel further than a lifetime, where a drop of amber crossed a continent, where enemies could trade without a word, and where a gift could bind 100 islands into one. They did not just have an economy. They invented the whole idea of it. And we have been trading ever since. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed following that shell across the world, take a second to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.